Welcome to World War II, Both Sides of the Wire, the podcast where we lift the lid, bust the myths, and explore the incredible history of the Second World War from the Allied and Axis perspectives. I'm Jesse Alexander, a public historian specializing in the history of the two world wars.
And I am Matthias Strohn, German officer, professor of military studies, and author. In this episode, we will look at some of the most common and persistent myths of the Second World War. So, Jesse, why do you think that these myths are important? And which of these myths, as a historian, really do drive you crazy when you hear about them?
Well, there's no shortage of those, Matthias. And that's kind of why I thought it was a good topic for us to choose together to start this new podcast. So welcome to all the new listeners out there. We're very happy that you've joined us for the first ever episode of World War II, Both Sides of the Wire. And yes, we're talking about myths. And there's an emotional attraction, I think, to myths because they cause us to debate, they cause us to argue. But I think there's also a kind of a relevance to how we understand history with myths, because the historical facts are one thing, then you have historical arguments that are based on those facts in a reasonable manner, and then you have myths that can go all over the place, that can be used for political purposes, and sometimes they're more influential than actual reasonable historical argument. And that's why I think it's a fascinating topic to explore. And always an exciting one, always one that causes a few people to get their feathers a little ruffled. And so why not dive right into it from the start? And I think if we're going to talk about World War II myths, we've got to start from the beginning, as they say in German, the Urkatastrophe of the 20th century, the First World War, the original catastrophe, which ends with this Versailles Treaty. And very often you hear this idea that the Versailles Treaty was terrible, and it made World War II inevitable. And I know, Matthias, that inevitable in history is something that you take issue with.
No, that's absolutely right, Jesse. Well, first of all, it's good to get lots of German words in right from the beginning, so I like that. And I think you're absolutely right. So nothing in history really is inevitable. Quite often, when you look at history, we think that everything is predestined, predetermined, because history turns out and pans out in a particular way. But it's not necessarily so. So everything can take a different turn. And this is an absolute perfect example that you just mentioned, the Versailles Treaty. A lot of people, even today, and from 1919 onwards, thought that this treaty would lead to another war, i.e. World War II. So this whole idea of the second 30 Years' War. It is perhaps a bit difficult to imagine that the Second World War in its shape or form really would have taken place if we hadn't had the First World War. But whether it's all really the fault of the Versailles Treaty, it's probably too easy to say. Because when you look at the consequences of the war, we need to delve a little bit deeper. And I know that you've got some very good understanding of the Versailles Treaty and the consequences. So just talk us through it.
Well, I think, this idea of inevitability is a problem, right? So no one's trying to say that the Versailles Treaty and the other treaties with the Central Powers at the end of the First World War were not flawed. Of course, we can easily dissect many of their flaws, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they guarantee something. There's 20 years in between 1919 and 1939. A lot of things happen in that time. There's a different international order in Europe. Not all of that is related to the Versailles Treaty. I mean, the Russian Revolution was not caused by the Versailles Treaty, which creates the Soviet Union, a kind of state that doesn't really fit in the traditional international order and upends the balance of power that had existed previous to 1914. So I think that we can't let everything off the hook that happens after 1919. Governments in the 1920s, in the 1930s, they make a lot of decisions. They have a lot of choices that can be made. They're historical agents. And by saying that Versailles guarantees a certain outcome, we just forget about historical agency, this ability for governments to make different kinds of decisions. And that includes, in some ways, sort of letting the Nazis off the hook for some of their terrible ideological choices, right? By saying, oh, we need to have a war because of Versailles, and then, well, the ideological thing just goes alongside it. No, we have to look at the range of choices that were possible. And I think there's also an argument that, if the circumstances had been different, the Versailles Treaty would never have been loved in Germany by most people. I think there's probably a consensus on that. But they might have been able to get over it if the economy had recovered and the Great Depression hadn't come, if the politics had stabilized a little bit more, if the US hadn't withdrawn its support from France and Britain to apply the treaty's conditions, and so on and so forth. So there's a lot of counterfactuals. I'm not trying to muddy the waters with all sorts of what could have beens, but the purpose I'm mentioning all of those other factors is to get away from this inevitability problem.
You're absolutely right, and you've talked a lot about ideology and Nazism, and of course you do find a very prominent school of thought in Germany at that particular time. So it's all Versailles' fault. So if we manage to turn back the wheel, everything will be fine. Germany will be the leading world power again. We've all heard of the stab in the back myth, so that the German army was actually winning in the West in the First World War, and it's because Jews and Social Democrats stabbed the army in the back. That's why Germany surrendered. So you can see where this leads to. But I think when you look at the period of 20 years that you have, there are lots of other factors that come into play here. And you already mentioned one, which I think is absolutely crucial. Well, it's the economy, stupid, isn't it? So that's exactly it. So when you look at the rise of the Nazis, or both extremes, you even have to look at the left-wing extremists, like the communists, for example. When do they rise? Well, it's the same thing all the time in every country, even today. When the economic situation is bad, individuals are suffering, they're looking for easy answers and easy solutions. So if the Weimar Republic in Germany had stabilized properly in the 1920s and had then been hit by, for example, the Wall Street crash later on, probably the Weimar Republic would have survived. Yes, the Versailles Treaty wouldn't have been loved, but you would have found a way to cope with it, and that would have been fine. So, and I think that applies to pretty much all the countries that didn't really like the treaty.
And that's the short version, folks, of what is a very enduring myth with all sorts of proponents. People interpret John Maynard Keynes's famous critique of the treaty as being the gospel truth, when it is, of course, also a very critiquable book in its own right. But our purpose today is not to go on a deep dive for an hour into the intricacies of Versailles and its role. We want to give you a sampling. We want to give you a little flavor, a buffet, let's say, of myths of World War II, just to whet your palates, to continue this metaphor. I don't know how I got there, so that we can get into all the aspects of this mythology surrounding World War II. And I think another hot topic is the German military. So we have all sorts of ideas out there that the German military was head and shoulders above the competition, that they were blowing everyone else out of the water, and they were almost some sort of supermen. If you have the misfortune to surf some of the corners of the history internet, you'll find that type of thinking quite a bit. As a German, and as a German who holds a commission in the German army, these are your professional forebears in a way. How do you assess that myth surrounding the German army in the Second World War?
Well, I think if you really want to answer this, you need to understand that there is not one German army in the Second World War. I would argue that the German army in the early years of the war, when casualties are still relatively light, is actually, compared to other armies, quite good. And I think this is also very, very important. You can't be the super army where everyone's a superhero. But what really matters in war, that you're better than your opponent in whatever shape or form. Whether you're using better training, better operational thought, you've got better equipment, you just need to be better than the other side. So if you say they're all superhumans, that of course is complete nonsense. I think that in the early days, the training of the German army was actually quite good, and they were reasonably well prepared. You also find on the other side the problem that when the German army enlarges from the mid-1930 onwards, that quality to a degree goes out the window, because you enlarge an army from roughly at that stage 250,000 men to about 2.5 million. And you can't do that without the loss of quality. But compared to other armies, they are still relatively good. Fast forward to the second half of the war. So think after the big battles in the east where all the casualties occur. The people that are coming through now are very, very badly trained, some of them not really trained at all. And that army is a very different army. So if you ask me personally, from a pure operational thought, for example, who did the operational art of war as a best army in the second half of World War II, I would probably say the Soviets. When you look at air power, when you look at other things, every nation is good at some stuff, not so good at others. To begin with, the Germans are very good. Second half, not so good anymore.
Yeah, I think it's important to make these kind of distinctions. And we're going to come back to this theme, I think, a little bit throughout the episode today. The war is massive, it's global, and it happens over 6 years. And one of the weaknesses of some of the myths is oversimplifying. And I think there is something to the idea of German quality militarily in World War II. Obviously, it's not for nothing that they won this string of quite impressive victories at the beginning of the war over weaker opponents, yes, but as you say, all you have to be is better. You don't have to be perfect. So there is something to that. I mean, they cut through the Red Army in 1941 for several hundred kilometers in a way that shows they are superior, but that's not the full story. And I think that's important. Another aspect that I like to think about when thinking about this topic or when trying to grapple with this myth that comes up is they don't do logistics particularly well. And as the old saying goes, amateurs do tactics and professionals do logistics, or something along those lines. Your army is not only the guys holding the guns or the guys pulling the firing cords behind the guns, behind the larger guns, the artillery pieces, right? It's the whole system. And that's, I think, a weakness of the German army is this logistical weakness. Also, motorization is a problem. Of course, there's lots of great propaganda film footage of German panzers. They do extremely well. There's this exciting concept of blitzkrieg, which is another partial myth in and of itself that we may touch on. And today, of course, if listeners out there, if you play video games, computer games related to World War II, the German equipment is usually rated the best. Right? You're not going to get better than a Panther or a Tiger II in a computer game. But in practice, most of the army is not that. So not only do you have to divide the German army in time, you have to divide the German army by arm, branch, let's say, because most of them are using horse-drawn supply right up until the end of the war. And so it works to some extent, but it then becomes also a bit of a problem. I want to throw in a quote here because I feel like this encapsulates a little bit some of the counter argument to the myth. It's a quote from a very famous World War II historian, Gerhard Weinberg, and this is what he had to say about this idea. Germany's military leaders were certainly competent at the tactical level, but hardly beyond that. In about the same number of months of serious fighting, out of an only slightly larger population, they got almost 3 times as many of their soldiers killed as in World War I. And they signed off on more than 100 times the number of death sentences on their own officers and men. By their conduct of a war of annihilation in the East, they managed the extraordinary accomplishment of converting Stalin from a bloody and hated dictator into the benign defender of his people from a fate far worse than anything they had experienced. So he ties in a bit of the political aspect of war waging in the East as well. But I think that's a pretty decent start for a myth busting.
As you just said in the quote, so the Germans are very, very good at the tactical level. And they fight quite well because they're well trained. And their training, particularly in the early phases of the war and before the war breaks out, is probably more realistic than what you could find in most other armies. So they were well trained at that level. The operational art, some generals are very good at this, some are not so much. And again, as you advance in time, go to the second half of the war, probably then most of the times not so good anymore. And particularly when you look at the strategic level, well, there's a very simple fact here. Well, Germany lost. So Germany's strategy in both world wars was actually shambolic. Now, you probably can't blame the soldiers for that because that's what the politicians have to decide. But it's all part of the same parcel, isn't it? So if your strategy is awful, then you're not going to win. And if your strategy is very, very good, then your army perhaps doesn't need to be the best army in the world because in the long run, you will still win. As you said, well, the Germans logistically are very, very poor. So logistics is something that, well, even today you say logistics is something that just happens. It doesn't have the wow or the sexiness factor. It's boring. It's counting nuts and bolts and ammo, and no one wants to do this. So if you want to have the cool jobs, even today, so you go into the G or S3, mainly G. So that's operations. So you want to stand in front of a big map with lots of crayons and then just say, well, now we're moving east. That's the sexy stuff. That's what everybody wants to do. No one is really interested in logistics because it's dead boring. But there's another quote, apparently comes from Rommel: logistics isn't everything, but without logistics, everything else is nothing. And the Germans quite simply, but you might say perhaps they even understood that. But of course, in their strategic assessment, being surrounded by a world of enemies, you need to be able to fight a sharp, crisp, fast war. And that had always been the German or the Prussian tradition. Go back to Frederick the Great in the 18th century, exactly the same thing. So like in a boxing match, so you need to make sure that you knock out the enemy in the first round. Look at France 1940, that's exactly what happens. However, if the opponent still stands in round 9, you have a problem. And that's exactly what happened to the Germans. And other armies are much, much better at this. So the British, the Americans, even the Russians, they can afford to lose battles because they have the hinterland. They've got, in the British case, colonies. There's America is there. So all these things lending support that the Germans simply don't have.
I'm glad you mentioned Rommel, because he's a figure as well who's surrounded in a certain mythology. Many popular history depictions, especially, will sort of say that Rommel was one of, if not the greatest general of the war, or even one of, or perhaps the greatest general of all time, which is a very bold claim, but I've seen it around, and I've certainly seen it sort of hinted at. How would you assess Rommel? What do you think are his strengths and weaknesses? Where does he sort of match the myth, and where does the myth kind of go off the rails?
Well, that's another great question. And again, we could fill 2 or 3 or 4 or 10 episodes on that, I think. To keep it relatively short, I think we can link this to what we just discussed about the quality of the German army on the whole. So Rommel, I think, was a very good tactician. So he was very good at commanding everything up to, perhaps you might say, a division or perhaps a corps, leading from the front, because that's what he liked to do. Now, you might ask the question whether that is the right place for a division or corps commander to be. These were questions that were being asked at that time as well. But of course, inspiring to the man fighting. So that was very good. But the moment you go higher up, and you see when he becomes, for example, the commander of the army group in France, the big debate about tanks, where the tank's going to be just before D-Day, all these things. He's not flawless. And I think in the German case, that's very interesting. After the war, that was very much realized. And Rommel was held in relatively high regards, but it's interesting to see that this whole myth around Rommel actually was produced and came to the fore far more in the English-speaking world, particularly in the UK. When you look at the first 5 or 6 biographies written of Rommel, they're all in English, not a single German one. And what Rommel then became a figure that was being debated in the German case in the last 10, 15, 20 years was very much about his role in the 20th of July plot, which is, of course, a very German topic. So trying to kill Hitler. Did he know about this? Did he not know about this? Was he active in it? Was he not an active supporter? So that's another big debate. And in many ways, this debate has overshadowed Rommel's tactical and operational successes in Germany.
Yeah, I think if one wants to push the myth busting to a bit more of an extreme, because there are other factors, of course, one might even say that if you look at Rommel's track record in the Second World War, he never won a lasting victory. All his dramatic victories in the Western Desert were overturned in relatively short order, and then he's put in command in France and fails to stop D-Day. Now, of course, you might very reasonably make the argument that no German commander at that time could have really stopped D-Day, but if the myth says that, Rommel was the best ever, well, why did he fail essentially to gain a lasting victory and fail in his last and perhaps most important task?
If you've seen the Rommel film, there is this the famous quote in there where Kluge, the other field marshal, arrives in France to take over the army group, and so he gets briefed by Rommel, and then he says, "Well, my dear Rommel, it's very obvious you haven't commanded anything above a division yet." So I mean that's a bit unfair, but I think you're absolutely right. Say Rommel was also very, very good at self-promoting, and of course that only gets you so far in life and also in war. At some point, you need to deliver.
And I think Rommel wasn't the only German general who was good at self promoting. Now, he didn't survive the war to kind of create his own myth after it. He did that starting after the First World War. But there were quite a few other German generals who did put in a lot of time and effort after the Second World War to trying to shape a certain perception, which has led to some other myths. Quite a few of them worked for the United States, for example, to produce reports on how the fighting went against the Soviets, because the US was thinking, well, the Soviet Union is now our enemy. Maybe we can glean some of the knowledge from the Germans who fought them for so long, which lent itself to a certain shaping, let's say, of the narrative. And one of the aspects of this is about Hitler. Now, we haven't talked a lot about him in the World War II. He's kind of an, you can't get around talking about Hitler. He's kind of important. And I think there's a lot of myths surrounding him as well. Not only that he theoretically went to Argentina, which is, of course, not a sustainable interpretation, let's say, but in terms of his responsibility for German military defeat. There's this idea out there that Hitler was overruling his generals who were professional, who knew better, and he just overruled them into awful mistakes because he didn't know what he was doing. Now, I'm not saying, of course, that Hitler was a pure military genius. I don't think very many people would make that argument these days, although obviously it was quite a popular one for a few years in the early 1940s. But I do think that the role of the generals in their mistakes and also Hitler's willingness to accept his general's advice has been kind of underestimated. I mean, one of the reasons why the invasion of France and Belgium was delayed so many times is because Hitler was trying to listen to his generals. There were huge debates back and forth. What kind of plan should we have? Where should we send the troops? Should it be the Manstein plan, which is a little more daring, going through the Ardennes forest and so on? Or should we have a more cautious plan, like Halder suggested at first, where we kind of advance on a broader front? And Hitler's not just wantonly overruling. He's involved. He's listening to these discussions. And there are some other examples of this type of thing, right? Refusing to retreat is another question where all the generals afterwards said, oh, we would have retreated. We would have done this or that better, but Hitler forbid it. Although, of course, he also approved some retreats, like out of southern France, like out of the Balkans in 1944. These are moves that Hitler approves. So there's quite a lot going around Hitler and his relationship with his generals.
It's a very interesting topic, and you already mentioned it when you read the memoirs from the 1950s and the 1960s. For example, Manstein's Verlorene Siege, Lost Victories. It's even in the title, isn't it? So Manstein writes a book and says, well, if only we had been given the free hand in the East, we would have won. But all these operational victories were taken away from us because Hitler decided to interfere. And that is so blatantly, obviously wrong. But of course, it suits the political situation in the 50s and 60s. You mentioned you've now got a Cold War. So NATO, the Americans, are looking at how do you fight against the Soviets? Those guys who've got most experience, of course, are the Germans. So you ask them. And of course, no one's going to turn around and say, well, terribly sorry, I got that wrong. So it's very easy to blame someone who's dead. Unless, of course, as you just said, well, he lives somewhere in Argentina together with Elvis Presley. Marilyn Monroe is the waitress. You never know. But otherwise, he's probably dead. Actually, we do know that he's dead. But it's, of course, he's the scapegoat, and that makes it very, very easy. What is also very interesting when you look at the Hitler and the military relationship, of course, in the early years, he quite often gets it right, which is really interesting. You already talked about the plan for 1940. When you look at the original plans, the German invasion plans, they're very much like the 1914 Schlieffen plan, going through Belgium, a very, very uninspired plan. And apparently Hitler has a complete fit when he sees this. And there is an argument or a school of thought which say, well, the German journalists didn't want to invade, so they came up with a plan they knew had failed about 20 years earlier. So Hitler would see light and wouldn't do it. So then he changes the plan or accepts the other version, and they win the most spectacular military victory of the 20th century, probably you would argue. Perhaps some people would have said in the history of time. That's why he was then called the greatest leader, military leader of all time, the Gröfatz, which of course later on became a bit of a joke calling him that. You might argue he also got it right in Russia in 1941 in Moscow. The whole debate, shall we retreat or not, or stay and fight? It's very bloody. It's very, very nasty. Lots of people get killed. Lots of equipment get lost. But after the battle is over, the general consensus was really, well, if the German army had retreated, as most of the generals had advised, the entire Eastern army would have been destroyed. So again, he kind of gets it right there. But then towards the end, he kind of loses it. And again, the big turning point perhaps is also the 20th of July. After that, he doesn't trust anybody anymore. He wants to control everything, and you simply can't do that, and it doesn't work. So yes, Hitler is the scapegoat, very easy. Difficult character, of course, but a far more ambivalent relationship than many people have said. And of course, that's not only a German thing. You find that basically in every country where you have a military apparatus working together with a military with a political leadership. Look, for example, at the UK. Look at the relationship between Churchill and Ellenbrook. And when you read Ellenbrook's diaries, I mean, he's scathing about Churchill. He thinks, well, what is this man doing? And of course, we remember Churchill's great ideas and Churchill's great speeches. But as someone once said, well, for one great speech, he gave 10 that, well, are forgotten, and rightly so. And for every good idea that he had, whether it was politically or from a military point of view, he had at least 10 that weren't all that great. And Ellenbrook, well, basically goes crazy and mental about twice a day because Churchill comes up with another great idea. But then, of course, you have a different system there in place, and Churchill can't push things through the same way that Hitler can.
Yeah, I think Churchill is another sort of mythologized figure. And that's one of the key aspects. One of the fascinating aspects is that, we remember the inspiring political leader, but we don't necessarily get reminded all that much about the completely erratic strategist that he was, pushing for these fanciful invasions of the Balkans, which would strategically not necessarily have brought much and would have been very difficult to maintain, and so on and so forth. He bears some of the responsibility for the Mediterranean focus of the Allies in 1943 and a very difficult Italian campaign. And that's sort of forgotten about in some senses because you have this lionized figure of defiance, mostly crystallized in 1940 when he becomes prime minister and then eloquently and passionately keeps the UK in the war and defends the Allied cause until the Soviet Union and US arrive on the scene.
You're absolutely right when you talk about 1940 and Churchill's role here. And of course, when you look at Britain at that time, and you look at the German plans for the invasion, for example, Operation Sea Lion, there are also lots of myths around this as well. So this whole idea that Britain was standing all alone and is the only country still fighting, to me is one of the biggest myths of the Second World War, because Britain wasn't alone. Britain still has an empire, and even at that stage, you've got Allied troops stationed in the UK. And in many ways, for example, the New Zealanders were actually the best and best equipped ones that the British still had, or fighting in the British Isles if the Germans had landed, because the rest of the army had gone through the mill in places like Dunkirk. And so Britain was never really standing alone. Even at that stage, they're already getting quite a lot of support from the US, which later on, and I'm jumping ahead over a year, of course, leads to the German declaration on the US in 1941. You get from 1940, you get all these reports from this really, really frustrated German U-boat commander saying, well, we can see these American cargo ships going into British ports, but we can't do anything about this. Practically, they're already at war with us. Let us sink our ships. One of the reasons why Germany declares war on America. Another interesting story to explore why this really happened. Too many interesting topics here, but that's a fascinating one. Then look at what the Germans were actually planning. The German plans, and I've seen the German plans in the archives. The Germans were never really thinking of invading the UK. Hitler comes up with this idea. It's more of a propaganda tool, a political tool. When you look at the planning, the preparations, they're more than half-hearted. And probably Hitler and also the military are quite glad, in a way, when Hitler loses interest in the UK and turns attention to the East again. So there's another very, very big myth. So Britain was not on the verge of an enemy invasion. The Germans themselves were not quite sure if they would even make it across the Channel had they tried.
And certainly the German Navy, Army, and Air Force also had completely different assessments of the feasibility of such a plan. I mean, to a certain extent, from what I understand, the planners who had serious doubts just weren't necessarily willing to voice those very enthusiastically and were kind of reluctantly making the plans with the hope that they would never be implemented or needed, which of course they were not as things turned out. But I would like to insert here that as a Canadian, the myth that Britain was alone does kind of rub me the wrong way, because Canada was certainly there, as well as New Zealand, as well as Australia, as well as India, and the whole rest of the empire/Commonwealth for those terrible, admittedly terrible and difficult months, or year, I suppose, when the British Commonwealth and Empire as a whole were the only main Allied state still resisting the Germans.
And of course, there's another example from 1940 when you look at the Battle of Britain, the finest hour in British history. When you look at the pilots who were fighting on the British side, you find an awful lot of people not coming from the UK. And a lot of them, of course, also got shot down. So again, another myth that the RAF just shot down hundreds and thousands of German planes and hardly lost any of their own fighters. Of course, completely untrue. But there is a fundamental difference, of course, during the Battle of Britain. So if you're a German bomber crew and you get shot down over London, you end up in a prisoner of war camp. If you're a British Spitfire Hurricane fighter pilot, well, you go down, you make your way to the airfield and you jump into the next plane and you can fly again. And of course, the workhorse of the Royal Air Force was not the Spitfire, but it was the Hurricane. Another myth that, the Spitfire is the more beautiful plane. Maybe that's why.
It's true. I have to say, when I was a kid, we had these little styrofoam airplanes you could assemble with a little plastic propeller, and you'd throw them and they'd fly off in the wind. Absolutely loved those. Thanks to my grandfather, a World War II veteran himself of the Canadian Army, for introducing me to those as a kid. Many happy hours. And I loved the Spitfires. Something about the shape of the wings. I know the Hurricane was more important for that earlier war period, especially, but something about the look and sleek kind of design of the Spitfire, I really like it. I read somewhere that a few Lend-Lease Spitfires that ended up in the Soviet Union didn't get very high marks from the Red Air Force pilots, but hang them. I liked it. So, on this topic, though, on this topic of the UK standing alone and that sort of mythology, I think it goes well with another topic with another myth that we were discussing just before we came live on air, which is the idea that one allied country sort of won the war on its own, or mostly on its own. And you'll find this myth in different places. You'll find this myth in the US, where they think that, America saved the day for everyone and everybody else was just kind of riding its coattails. You'll find it in the UK, largely based on the fact that they were in it for the whole length of the war and stood alone, so to speak, for part of it. And you'll definitely find it in Russia, where it forms the basis not only of a lot of historical mythology, but a lot of current day political mythology, that the Soviets were innocent victims in 1941 and did all the dirty work for the war and deserve to be the only sort of credible victors in the aftermath.
I find it quite incredible that even today we are always still thinking about who did most in the war, who won the war, very much along national lines. And I think that's really quite interesting. And also, in a way, you might say it's astonishing. You already mentioned the US, of course. You mentioned Britain, a YouGov poll, which was conducted a few years ago, asking the British population, who do you think did most to win the Second World War? Over 80% of Brits said it was Britain. You go to the Soviet Union, to Russia, as you've already said. They think exactly the same. It was the Russians. I remember being on a staff ride, a military staff ride in Russia, when we could still go there, when we were not friends, but at least talking to each other. And we talked to Russian veterans, and we talked to a Russian tour guide we had in the Kursk area. And they were absolutely adamant that the Allies weren't even in the war. If anything, they'd probably try to make the Soviets lose, and the Soviets single-handedly won the war. So there was no mention of the American and British support, the Murmansk convoys, all these things. That never happened in their views. But as I said, it's national views, and you find the same narrow-mindedness in the UK. You find the same narrow-mindedness, perhaps even more, in the US. And of course, there are different criteria. How do you decide which side did most to win a war? I mean, different criteria. So one, for example, if you want to look at that, it's casualty figures. How many casualties do you inflict, or how many casualties do you take? If you take that, then it's very, very obvious and clear that it is the Soviet Union who won the war, because they inflict the highest blood loss on the Germans and they lose the most casualties. It's perspective here is also very important. When you look at, for example, the siege of Leningrad, the second city in modern-day St. Petersburg, which the Germans besieged from 1941 to 1944. During the defense of the city, and that's now military death, but also civilian death included, because the Germans tried to starve the city out, the Soviet Union loses more men than Britain, the Commonwealth, colonies, dominions, whatever you want to call it, and the US put together in the entire war. So that really does put it into perspective. So if you look at the blood loss, America doesn't really feature, to be perfect honest, regardless of what they tell you on Saving Private Ryan. It's very much about the Eastern Front. However, there are other ways, of course, how you can win a war. And that is, again, coming back to this point about logistics. The Soviet Union could not have fought on from 1941 onwards without, in particular, American support. You have entire formations of the Red Army that are equipped with Western equipment. There are pictures of Soviet tanks rolling through the streets of Berlin in May 1945. And strangely enough, they're all American. So that's another very, very important aspect. You then have wars at different areas as well. Is it just the land war? The moment you bring in the sea war and bring in the air war, of course, the last two are very much the domain of the Western allies. So the whole idea of the second front, when Stalin says, we need you to open a second front, land in France, and Churchill and the Americans say, well, you already have a second front, it's the air war. And when you look at the damage that does and how that impacts the ability of the Germans to fight in the East, or the Air Force now being used in and around Germany to protect German industry, all sides actually contributed to victory over Germany in 1945.
Yeah, I think it's not possible to disentangle the Allied war effort and put it into these national chest-beating silos, boxes, right? And I noticed, because to be honest, in Canadian public education in the 1990s, when I was in high school, we didn't learn about World War II. We learned it through a Canadian lens, but we didn't. The main question that we were thinking about, it was the experience of Canadians and how it changed Canada, and not did Canada and the British Empire do more to win the war than the US or than the Soviet Union? On the other hand, that is the steady diet of how it's learned in Russia. And I remember when I still remember this conversation was amazing to me at the time. It was an eye opener. It was years ago. I was staying in a hostel in Volgograd today. Back in the day, Stalingrad, of course. I was there to visit the battlefields, the cemeteries, the museums, the memorials. And in my broken Russian, I was able to kind of have a few conversations with other people staying there. And immediately, one of the first questions that a couple of them asked me, people, just regular Russians who were staying at this hostel, who do you learn won the war? Do you learn that we won it, or do you learn that you won it? And I was kind of surprised. I'm like, that's not how I learned it. That wasn't the main question. But it is for quite a lot of people, and it certainly is for pop culture, especially films. Hollywood definitely has the US, for example, winning the war more or less on its own. I think the Cold War contributes to that as well. It made it a lot harder to continue the idea of a common victory, of an intertwined victory, that Lend-Lease helped the Soviets, and without it, they probably wouldn't have been able to continue, or with extreme difficulty. There are accounts that Stalin himself admitted that the Soviet Union would not have been able to continue the war. So all in all, I think, yeah, we can discount with these ideas that there was one Allied country that won the war on its own. The Germans had to spend huge amounts of resources putting into anti-aircraft, guns, munition, personnel, night fighters to defend against the bombing raids. Now, the bombing war has its own myths and debates surrounding it, but it's indisputable that the Germans devoted massive resources to defending against it, which of course greatly helped the Soviet cause in the East and helped them inflict a lot of those casualties on a German army that had far less air support and far fewer resources than it would have had otherwise. Not to mention the side note that not all of the Soviet Union's casualties were due to effective resistance against the Germans. Some of their casualties, and we're talking very large numbers, were due, unfortunately, to the incompetence of their own political and military leadership to some extent. But I digress. As usual, I digress on all of these topics. Now, one of the things that I think is related a bit to this oversimplification theme, where we want to focus on something, right? We want to focus on some explanation. Was it the Soviets? Was it the Americans? Was it the Brits? Was it a turning point? Was there a turning point in the Second World War? This idea of turning points is very appealing, including to the hosts of YouTube channels who sometimes put out videos entitled Turning Point or Not. For example, just so that I don't seem like I'm coming off as holier than thou, I also participate in the turning point debates. But I think it's fair to qualify it as a myth that there's one turning point in the Second World War.
I think you're absolutely right. When you look at the list of turning points that people compile, it links it a little bit to what we we're just talking about earlier, the national lens. So, how do you identify a turning point, and who and what is this turning point for? So, probably the most famous turning points that people have talked about are 1941, so the Battle for Moscow. If the Germans had seized and taken Moscow, they would have won the war. I mean, that is complete nonsense. When you look at the German forces that are being used in this area, so at that stage, the German army in the east is cold. They're quite literally freezing to death. They're running out of manpower. And even if they'd seized Moscow, they get to about 7 kilometers from the Kremlin. The recce patrols, they would have been able to hold it. And even so, the Soviets would have been able to fight on. Go back to 1812. The same example, Napoleon seizes Moscow, but the war isn't over. But that's quite often seen as one of the big turning points because they didn't seize it. That's how they lost the war. You then have, of course, in particular 1943, where an awful lot of people, again, it's the Eastern Front, look at Stalingrad. Stalingrad is the big turning point of the war. Was it really? Probably not. I would argue at that stage the Germans already lost. And actually, when you look at some of the German reports and accounts from before the battle, it's really, really eye-opening. There's an account from the German intelligence section looking at the armies in the east. And before the German summer offensive, case Blau, blue, is launched in the summer of 1942, the German assessment is by their own intelligence services that even if Germany manages to achieve everything they set out to achieve, reach all their goals, and seize all the objectives, the Soviet Red Army will not be exhaustively beaten and will be able to launch counterattacks in the winter, which the Germans will not be able to counter. So you might actually say, here's an interesting turning point. The German intelligence service realized the war's lost before they even launched a big offensive towards Stalingrad. And there's another turning point, for example, if you want to bring that no one ever talks about, which to the Germans was actually far more drastic than what happened in Stalingrad, happening pretty much at the same time. And that's North Africa. 250,000 German and Italian soldiers surrendering at Tunis. Not only all the numbers of soldiers going in the bag and being captured, but also the whole strategic implications of that. Suddenly, the soft underbelly of Europe is completely open. Turning point, probably again too strong a term. And then if you're American or you're British, of course, you would identify D-Day as the big turning point. I would personally argue by 1944, Germany has completely lost the war anyway, and D-Day didn't do anything to win the war. It sped up the whole process. But if you just look at the sheer fighting, coming back to the points we raised earlier, supported by American and British materiel, the land war was won in the East. And of course, if you want to have another date here that, again, no one talks about, is June 1944 on the Eastern Front. Exactly 3 years after the German invasion, case Barbarossa, the Soviets launched Operation Bagration, which within a few weeks leads to the largest collapse and defeat of the German army in its entire history. No one in the English-speaking world ever talks about this. So again, this whole idea of turning points is very much seen through a national lens, which immediately tells you that they're not real turning points.
Yeah, I mean, there are other points as well that get thrown into the mix. Also for the Pacific War, Midway, for example, being a complete turning point and this sort of thing. I think there's something to the idea, to the argument that the Second World War is so big, so long, and so complex that it's not possible to pinpoint one moment and say, this is where it turned. It's such a huge thing with inertia, different parts of the war moving at different speeds, so much going into this incredibly massive logistics effort all around the globe that it just doesn't lend itself to a turning point in the way that you might say a 19th century battle has a turning point as a cavalry charge and then all of a sudden the left wing collapses and so on and so forth. It's just not that kind of conflict. In fact, I think there's something to the idea that the war is managed as much as it's fought. So it's this huge machine that is kind of being managed. It's of course being fought, but in the sense of the bird's eye view, You don't have your Napoleon on a hill who's kind of directing the combat operations. It's being managed in boardrooms, in committee meetings, in general staff meetings, and that you sort of shift the balance and things evolve over time, and eventually there's a critical mass and things go one way or go the other way for a certain amount of time, and then it becomes decisive in the end. But there's no one particular turning point, and I think there's quite a bit to that school of thought.
I think you're absolutely right, and I think you hit the nail on the head there. And I again think it's more due to our understanding, our view of wars in general, and particularly this war, because it is so big, and because when you read about it, when you see films, everything is always focused and concentrated on what happens at the very front, so the fighting itself. That's what everyone's interested in. As we've now said a number of times, no one's interested in logistics. It's boring. You read a book, you watch a film. It's all about the actual fighting that happens, but it's only one part of the whole thing. And when you go through, and I was just, as you were talking, I was just thinking about it, thinking back in history. Well, it's been quite a while since we left the period of decisive battles behind. You don't really find them in the 20th century. You'd struggle to find one in the 19th century. Some people would say Waterloo, yes, but Waterloo is also just the culminating point of lots of things that happened before. You go to the 7 Years' War, they don't happen there. You go back to the 30 Years' War in the 17th century, they don't happen there. So you have to go back really, really a long period in time to find this one culminating battle like 1066. You lose a battle and suddenly you win a kingdom. This simply doesn't happen anymore, but we tend to focus on this, which I think is very much a driving factor, as you have said, to identify these turning points, because it just makes it easier.
This is, of course, one of the great criticisms of Napoleon's campaign in Russia, that he keeps seeking this decisive battle, and it's just not possible in the circumstances that the military conflict is taking place. But that is another tangent, folks. I have a bad habit of that. Love the Napoleonic campaign in Russia. It's one of the most fascinating topics I've ever had the pleasure of working with. But I want to bring us back around maybe to one of the last myths on our agenda today, which is not unrelated to the turning point idea. It's related to the massive global war effort and how that played out in the outcome of the war. And that is this concept that the Allies only defeated the Axis because of their superior numbers and superior resources.
That, of course, is the standard phrase. It takes us all the way back to the very beginning of this discussion about the fighting power of soldiers. And Martin van Creveld, for example, in his book, which is called Fighting Power, came to the conclusion, very mathematical, that 100 German soldiers would always roughly defeat 110 British soldiers, 120 American soldiers, and about 320 Soviet soldiers. Very mathematical and as such flawed, because war is not a science, it's an art, as good old Clausewitz once told us. So it takes us right back to this whole discussion. And there is always still today, as we said earlier, this idea that Germans were the superhumans. So the only way the Allies could win is by weighing them down, by wearing them out, or basically just by defeating them by sheer and with the use of sheer numbers, and crush the Germans. That is, of course, exactly what the Germans thought after the First World War. Again, coming back to another myth we've talked about, the Versailles Treaty, undefeated in the field because the Germans are the better soldiers, just defeated either by the stab in the back, or if you wanted to admit a little bit to these things, it was superior numbers. Of course, there is lots of other things going. When you look at the equipment, for example, and you've already mentioned it, when you think about German tanks in World War II, we always have a Panther, even better, a King Tiger, rolling through the Ardennes, rolling from A to B, whatever they do. And that's the picture that we have of German military might and military equipment. And yes, they were there, but these beasts only really come in, let's say, the new generation of tanks, whether it's Panthers or what have you, from 1943 onwards. The numbers are extremely small. So the majority of the German army, as you've already said, marches into battle in 1940 and 1944 and 1945, like their fathers had done in the First World War and their grandfathers had done in the war against France in 1870-71. It's exactly the same army. Motorization doesn't really happen. The tanks, yes, some of them are good. The early variants or the early models are actually quite poor. Go to 1940. So the best tank that the Germans have in 1940 when they invade France, that they have in large numbers, is actually a Czech tank, the T-38. That's the one they use. They've got a few Panzer IVs, which are quite good, with a short barrel at that time. but the numbers are so low that they simply don't make any difference. So what you do find here is a combination of equipment, but also the way you use it, the military arts, the military thinking behind that, which leads us to yet another myth we're not going to explore right now, but that's the whole, you already mentioned it as well, it's the whole blitzkrieg myth. We should probably do at least one episode on that. Again, we can talk for ages about these things. But I think that's one fundamental issue. And when you look at the superiority of not only the numbers, but also the troops, I've already mentioned it earlier. In the early stage, the German army is quite good. But of course, as the war progresses, all these good guys, well, as Hitler once said, well, it doesn't really matter what happens to the German army because all the good officers are dead anyway. So we're just left with a rebel. That's what he says when he sits in the bunker. And of course, you get the opposite development in the Allied camp, particularly the British and the Americans, where casualty figures are much, much lower. So they can get a much more fighting experience. So these guys, in relative terms, are much, much better towards the end of the war than their German counterparts.
This is quite rare, but I think I can say that I agree with Hitler on that point that you just made, that he just made, sitting in his bunker. Very rare that I would agree with him on anything, but I think that's a relevant point to this whole mythologized discussion, because war is more than numbers as well. Yes, a total war of the kind of the Second World War depends on industrial might, depends on resources, depends on logistics, but it's not only that. The Allies did, of course, over the course of the entire war, they had more potential in terms of resources, in terms of manpower, and so on. But especially in the early years of the war, they're not always fighting with a superiority in numbers. They don't always outnumber the enemy in certain critical moments, not necessarily turning points as such, but critical moments. For example, the Battle of Britain that we've talked about. The RAF doesn't have some sort of crushing superiority in the number of its fighters, and yet it's still able to defeat the Luftwaffe in that clash. Or the US wins the Battle of Midway, which sometimes people point to as a turning point in the Pacific War, but they have fewer carriers available to them in that battle than the Japanese do. And one of their carriers, the Yorktown, if memory serves, had just been sort of patched together and sent back out as soon as possible after the Battle of the Coral Sea. So you have these moments where the Allies are fighting tooth and nail. They're achieving some important victories that don't win them the war in the first half of the war, of course, and they are fighting from an inferior position. So I think that kind of puts paid to this myth. Another would be that, yes, of course, the Red Army outnumbers the Germans as a whole for the entire war. But if memory serves, in the early days and weeks of Barbarossa on the central part of the front, the Germans outnumber them. And that's quite helpful in those early stages for smashing deep towards Moscow. So you have these moments where things are not quite as simple as the myth would have us believe.
And of course, you can turn this around again as well, where you say, well, the Allies always had, as you just said, superiority, and the Germans, particularly in the later stages, didn't have any material whatsoever. Well, that's just simply untrue. German industrial output reached its peak in the summer of 1944, particularly because the Allies decided to bomb France and the Low Countries as a preparation for D-Day. But what you then have is, in the German case, for example, look at the Air Force. You've got quite a few planes sitting there and standing there, fighter planes, for example. But the problem is, in the later stages, that they simply don't have enough oil, i.e. petrol, to fly them, because in the later stages, having lost the Romanian airfields. And also, it's the experience of, if you stay with this example, the fighter pilots. Between January and June 1944, the German Air Force loses 99% of its fighter pilots. They're all dead, captured, what have you. So just think about what that means for the experience of the German Air Force. You're still getting people through, but these are not the peace-trained experts. These are guys who probably spend 5, 10, 15 hours. I think the average was 20 being trained. And then you're sent to the front line, where you now meet the American and British fighters, who at that stage are far more experienced than the Germans. And this is one of the main reasons why in 1944, 1945, German casualty numbers just go completely through the roof. So in the last year of the war, more people die in World War II than in all the years beforehand. And to a very large degree, it's because of incompetence.
Yeah, these last 2 years of the war, I think they contribute a lot to this myth that it was only a question of numbers, right? They overshadow. It's clear that in 1944-45, the Allies, despite the increase in German production, that they're able to bring to bear, especially let's say from fall 44 on, they're really able to bring to bear a significant superiority of weaponry and numbers of troops. But on the topic of resources, I think if you look at it a little bit differently than we traditionally do, let's say by the summer of 1942, the Axis controls potentially a huge amount of resources. All of Europe, deep into the Soviet Union, all sorts of oil fields in Romania, but also in the Caucasus, also in what is today Western Ukraine, in Galicia, there are oil resources there. The Japanese have conquered the Dutch oil fields in Indonesia, today's Indonesia. And of course, they have half of China occupied with all sorts of resources, different types of resources available to them in Manchuria. The problem is they cannot extract those resources and transport them to where they're needed. Well, there are other problems, but that's one of the key problems. So just saying the Allies have more resources, okay, there is something to that, but the Axis potentially has almost as much in 1942. They're just incapable of doing anything with it for reasons of political problems, for reasons of flawed strategy, for reasons of a lack of foresight, for reasons of taking military risks that then lose them access to those resources. So I think that's an interesting element that we forget about and that weakens, I think, that myth that the Allies only win due to number.
And of course, there is when you accept this, and I totally do. I think you're absolutely right. Of course, it shifts the entire strategy, as you just said. So, for example, in the British and the American historiography, quite often the most important battle is the battle for the Atlantic. And so everything else around it is not that important, really, because the most important thing is that we need to keep the sea lanes open. To just like you exactly just said, we need to get all the resources, whether it's men, material, whatever it is, from the States all the way to Europe. If you can't do that, and of course that had been the German strategy, well, naval strategy in both the First World War and the Second World War. It doesn't really matter what the Americans have. If they can't get it across to Europe, it doesn't really matter because they're a lame duck. So absolutely right. Again, it changes and shifts the perspective now, our standing of the war and what these perhaps turning points or crucial fronts really were.
And related to the logistical problem. So the Japanese have mass logistical problems due to sea lanes being cut off. But of course, one of the most famous / infamous anti-logistical campaigns or strategic campaigns is the bombing campaign in Europe. And it is also the subject of different myths, one of which, for example, is that the Americans were relatively precise in their bombing.
Yes, that is a very good myth. So the idea is that the British bombing at night, the Americans bombing during the day. The Americans were more successful in actually hitting their targets, also trying to hit the targets, whereas you might probably say the British weren't. Is that very true or not? So the Americans might have been slightly better, but that's mainly because, they attacked during the day, not during the night. And their doctrine is also a little bit different. British Air Force doctrine during the Second World War is to keep it very simple. It's a very complex and complicated subject, and it can also get quite heated, but to keep it very, very simple, is basically designed to strike terror into the civilians' population. It's not designed to destroy industrial output or the military. And you need to understand where it comes from. It's thinking of the First World War. After 4 years of trench fighting, lots of people killed. Wouldn't it be easier and better and also much cheaper to send a huge bomber fleet over to the enemy the moment war is declared? You destroy the city, the morale collapses, and they make peace. So that's the basic understanding of British strategic bombing in World War II. And for that, you don't have to be precise. I give an example of my hometown, Münster. That was very heavily bombed because in the northwest of Germany, the biggest raid that was launched, two very, very big ones, one in 1943 and then one in 1945. One of these has as the actual target the steps of the cathedral. That's the aim of the Allied or the British bombers. And it's a very big military garrison as well, because relatively close to France. So when the war is over, there's two things still left standing. It's the cathedral and it's the military installations. Everything else is completely gone. The city is destroyed to about 95%. But these are still standing. So the Americans were slightly better. But in the end, I would say it probably didn't really make a difference. It's more about the the approach, the philosophy behind that. The Germans have been criticized, of course, for example, the Blitz. But at least when you look at German air doctrine, of course, there are lots of very nasty bombings that Germans do as well. The very first one early on in the campaign against Poland, that is a city that gets bombed and completely destroyed. You then have the bombing of Rotterdam. You then have the Blitz. You have, again, what people don't talk about, for example, the bombing of Stalingrad. No one knows how many civilians die because they have been evacuated. The estimates reach from somewhere between 20 to 30 to 40,000, which would mirror the bombing of Dresden. But no one talks about this because we don't have these figures. On the whole, however, German air doctrine was slightly different. It was not designed to do this, but it was much more designed to provide close air support. That's also why the Germans don't have heavy bombers. And that's why when they try to do strategic bombing, like against London, for example, it simply can't work. And of course, when you switch to the Pacific theater, the bombing campaign again is different. And it's mainly because of these very, very long distances that the bombers would have to cover. So until you get to, for example, Midway or other places, Iwo Jima, it's very, very difficult for the Americans to launch bomber raids, massive bomber raids onto Japan. Later stage, they do. Of course, they destroy lots of Japanese city. Tokyo is completely destroyed. We tend to concentrate very much, of course, on the two nuclear bombs that are dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, but actually the bombing of Tokyo destroyed it even more. That was conventional bombing and caused far more direct casualties. Let's not talk about the long-term implications of the nuclear blast. But the bombing of Tokyo caused far more casualties than the direct casualties of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So you also have a bombing campaign in that part of the world while the war's going on, but it's taking a different shape and form.
Yeah, I think one of the dangerous sort of sub-myths, if I allow myself that term, dangerous, is sometimes in my line of work on the internet and so on, there's a lot of different communities, a lot of alternative interpretations, a lot of conspiracy theories. And one thing that comes up sometimes is, some people hold out this idea of the Allied bombing campaign. And of course, there's a legitimate argument to treat it or parts of it as war crimes. I think without taking a firm position, I can see where that argument comes from. And certainly there was terrible civilian suffering and death caused by the Allied bombing campaigns. But sometimes it's kind of wrapped into a bit of a mythological false equivalence that, both sides committed war crimes, and therefore we can't really be more hard on the Germans in our assessment of their war effort than we can on the Allies. And I think that's quite a myth itself as well. Because, of course, if you compare the ideological underpinnings of the war, and if you compare, of course, the Holocaust and so on, there is no comparison anymore.
No, I think you're absolutely right. And also when you just look at the air war itself, when you look at what the people thought at the time, I was involved in a research project on Allied bombing of German cities a few years ago. And it was really fascinating to see the reaction of the population itself in the bombed out cities. So, of course, you have Nazi propaganda. And the only thing actually that these bombing campaigns that were designed to break the people's morale, the only thing they achieved was actually to bring them closer to the Nazi party. But what you hardly ever heard were voices from and by the population saying that these are all war crimes, because they said this is a total war. And they all understood what the term total war meant by 1944. So the home front is a front. And this distinction between combatants and non-combatants was unfortunately taken away by, you might say, by both sides. But the Germans totally understood that, it was coming their way, and hardly any real complaints about that, saying, well, this is a war crime and that needs to be stopped. Take it to The Hague, which, of course, you couldn't in those days.
And that, folks, is the kind of insight from the other side of the wire that we hope to bring you on this podcast, World War II, Both Sides of the Wire. Today, we wanted to go for a little bit of a sampling of some of the hot topics, some of the hot myths of the Second World War. Of course, we could have said a lot more about each of them. And there are many other myths that are out there that we could discuss in the future. If you have a suggestion, by the way, for your favorite or least favorite World War II myth, let us know. Contact us, put a comment, let us know what you'd like to hear on the podcast. We're very glad that you were able to join us for this inaugural episode, and there will be many more. Matthias, I was going to say I had a blast, but coming on the heels of the bombing campaign discussion, maybe I should rephrase that. I had a great time delving into it with you, and I look forward to our future episodes. You've been listening to World War II Both Sides of the Wire, a Battle Guide production. To support the creation of future episodes, consider joining our dedicated supporter community, where you can enjoy exclusive benefits and connect with like-minded individuals. For more information, please see the show notes, and if you appreciated this episode, please leave a review on your chosen podcast platform. Thank you for listening.
Well, thank you very much. I thought it was absolutely brilliant. And I think we scratched the surface of so many different aspects and topics that, I think we've got enough material for the next 20 years. So, guys, stay tuned.